On May 22, 1832, Stephen Jumel lay dying in the upstairs bedroom of his Manhattan mansion. He'd fallen onto a pitchfork in his carriage house earlier that day. The wounds weren't immediately fatal, punctures to his torso, painful but survivable with proper care. A doctor had been called, bandages applied, the bleeding stopped. But Stephen's wife, Eliza, sent the doctor away. She told him she could manage the care herself. Hours later, Stephen was dead, bled out in his bed. The bandages had been removed, or had come loose, or had never been properly secured. Accounts varied. Eliza, 57 years old, had been married to Stephen for 22 years. He was her ticket to respectability, a wealthy French wine merchant who'd married a woman rumored to have been a prostitute and actress. Together, they'd bought this grand federal-style mansion in 1810, hoping to break into New York high society. Society never fully accepted them. Eliza's past was too scandalous, Stephen's background too common. The mansion, built in 1765 by British loyalist Roger Morris, gave them proximity to the elite but not membership. Now Stephen was dead. Eliza was a wealthy widow, and within 14 months she would marry Aaron Burr, the former vice president who'd killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel 28 years earlier. That marriage would last 3 years before Eliza filed for divorce. She hired Alexander Hamilton Jr., son of the man Burr had killed, as her divorce lawyer. The irony was deliberate, calculated, cruel. Burr would die on September 14, 1936, the exact day the divorce was finalized. Eliza would live another 29 years in the mansion, increasingly eccentric, increasingly isolated, walking the halls in tattered purple silk, yelling at neighborhood children who came too close. Dying alone in 1865 at age 90, demented and ostracized. The Morris-Jumel mansion still stands today at 65 Jumel Terrace in Washington Heights, Manhattan. It's the oldest house in Manhattan, built in 1765, predating the Revolution. George Washington used it as his headquarters in 1776. British and Hessian officers occupied it during the war. It's been a museum since 1904. Over 30,000 visitors tour it annually. They see the octagonal drawing room where Washington planned strategy, the bedroom where Eliza possibly murdered her husband, the dining room where she married Aaron Burr. And many visitors report seeing Eliza's ghost, a woman in a purple dress walking the second floor, angry, restless, still trying to claim the social acceptance she never achieved in life. The mansion was built to be a summer retreat for British elite. It became a Revolutionary War headquarters, then a murder house, then the residence of a woman who married the most infamous duelist in American history, then a haunted ruin where an old woman died alone. And now it's a deteriorating museum where columns collapse and guides tell ghost stories to tourists who pay to see where scandal, murder, and unrequited ambition left their marks. The question isn't why Morris-Jumel Mansion exists. The question is what happens when a house built for social climbing becomes a monument to everything that can go wrong when ambition meets reality. If you enjoy explorations of grand historical properties and the complex stories behind them, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which property you'd like me to explore next. Your support makes these deep dives possible, and I read every comment. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin with a summer mansion built in 1765 by a man who loved a woman who chose someone else, occupied during the Revolution by both sides of the war, and ultimately defined by a woman whose desperate climb towards respectability ended in murder, scandal, and dying alone in rooms that are still said to echo with her restless ghost. Roger Morris built the mansion in 1765 as a summer estate overlooking the Hudson River. Morris was a British military officer, wealthy through family connections and military service. In 1758, he'd married Mary Phillips, one of the wealthiest heiresses in colonial New York. Her family owned vast land holdings, over 50,000 acres across Westchester County and beyond. The marriage made Morris even wealthier and politically connected. He retired from active military service and focused on managing the Phillips properties and his own interests. But there's a romantic detail that shadowed the marriage. George Washington had courted Mary Phillips years earlier, before Morris. In 1756, young Washington, then a Virginia militia officer, had visited New York and met Mary. He was reportedly smitten. He courted her, but she chose Roger Morris instead, the wealthier, better-connected, more established suitor. Washington went back to Virginia, eventually married Martha Custis, and built his career. But the rejected courtship became part of historical legend. When Washington later used Morris-Jumel Mansion as his headquarters in 1776, romantics noted the irony. The house built by the man who won Mary Phillips became Washington's temporary home. In 1765, when Morris built the mansion, none of that mattered yet. He was simply building a summer retreat. The location was strategic. High ground in what's now Washington Heights, overlooking the Hudson River and Harlem River valleys. 8 miles north of the developed part of Manhattan. Rural, peaceful, with spectacular views. The architecture was Palladian, a Georgian style popular among wealthy colonists. Symmetrical facade, central entrance, octagonal rooms, unusual for the period. High ceilings, large windows, a 2-story portico with columns facing south toward the city. The house was built for entertaining and summer leisure, not year-round residence. The Morris family had a townhouse in Lower Manhattan for winter. This was their country estate. Construction took approximately 2 years. The house was completed by 1765, ready for the family to enjoy their rural retreat. They had 11 years. Then the Revolution destroyed everything. When the Revolutionary War began in 1775, Roger Morris faced an impossible choice. He was British. His entire identity, wealth, and social position came from the British colonial system. His military career had been in British service. His wife's family fortune depended on British property law. But he lived in New York, increasingly dominated by revolutionary sentiment. Patriots were seizing control. Loyalists were being targeted, ostracized, threatened. Morris chose loyalty to Britain, which meant, practically, fleeing. In 1776, as revolutionary forces gained control of New York, Morris and Mary abandoned the mansion and sailed for England. They left behind the summer estate, most of their possessions, and any hope of maintaining their American properties. The Continental Army promptly seized the mansion, and in September 1776, George Washington, now General Washington, commander of the Continental Army, established his headquarters there. The irony was thick. Washington, who'd courted Mary Phillips and been rejected, now occupied the mansion built by the man who'd won her. Did Washington think about that? Did it matter to him 20 years later in the midst of war? Probably not much. He had larger concerns, defending New York from the approaching British invasion. Washington used the mansion from September 14th to October 20th, 1776. He planned a defensive strategy in the octagonal drawing room. He met with officers. He wrote dispatches. He watched British ships approach from the mansion's high vantage point. And he lost. The Battle of Harlem Heights was fought nearby. The Continental Army was forced to retreat north. Washington abandoned the mansion on October 20th and withdrew from Manhattan entirely. British forces immediately occupied the house. For the remainder of the war, 1776 to 1783, Morris-Jumel Mansion served as headquarters for British and Hessian officers. Roger Morris never returned to America. He stayed in England, living on a British military pension and whatever wealth he'd managed to bring with him. He died in 1794 in Yorkshire, having lost his American properties to confiscation. Mary died in England in 2825, outliving her husband by 31 years. She never saw the mansion again after fleeing in 1776. The house they'd built for summer leisure became a casualty of war and political choice.
and after the war it would pass through various owners before Eliza Jumel arrived with her scandalous past and murderous future.
Eliza Bowen was born around 1775 in Providence, Rhode Island, though she lied about her birth year for her entire life, claiming to be younger than she was. Her early life is murky, deliberately obscured by Eliza herself and filled in by hostile gossip from enemies. What seems likely, she came from poverty, possibly illegitimate birth, minimal education. By her late teens or early 20s, she was in New York City working as an actress and possibly a prostitute. The theater in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was not respectable. Actresses were assumed to be sexually available. The line between stage performance and prostitution was blurry and often crossed. Eliza was beautiful, ambitious, charming when she wanted to be, and utterly determined to escape poverty and achieve social status. In 1804, she met Stephen Jumel, a French wine merchant who'd immigrated to New York and made a fortune in trade. Stephen was wealthy but not socially prominent. His background was common. He had money but not breeding. They were, in some ways, perfectly matched, both outsiders trying to break into elite New York society, both ambitious, both willing to use each other to achieve their goals. They married in 1810. Eliza was approximately 35, though she claimed younger. Stephen was in his 50s. Immediately after marriage, they bought the Roger Morris mansion, by then abandoned and deteriorating, having passed through several owners after being confiscated from Morris as Loyalist property. Eliza saw the mansion as her path to respectability. It had history. Washington had used it as headquarters. It was architecturally grand. If she could restore it and host society there, maybe she could overcome her scandalous past. She spent lavishly on renovations, French furniture, wallpaper imported from Europe, crystal chandeliers, everything designed to impress. She hosted parties, invited the elite, tried desperately to be accepted, and largely failed. New York society was willing to take her money, attend her parties, accept her hospitality, but they never fully accepted her. The whispers about her past never stopped. She was nouveau riche with a disreputable background. No amount of French furniture could change that. The rejection embittered Eliza. She became more aggressive, more demanding, more desperate. And Stephen, growing older and possibly regretting the marriage, became an obstacle to her ambitions. By 1832, their relationship was strained, and then came the pitchfork incident. On May 22, 1832, Stephen Jumel was in his carriage house when he fell onto a pitchfork. The wounds were serious but not immediately fatal. He was brought into the mansion. A doctor was called. Bandages were applied to stop the bleeding. Eliza sent the doctor away, saying she would care for Stephen herself. Hours later, Stephen was dead, bled out in his bed. The suspicious details. The bandages. Multiple sources claimed the bandages were removed or improperly secured. A doctor treating puncture wounds would have wrapped them tightly to prevent blood loss. If Stephen died from bleeding, the bandages either failed or were deliberately loosened. Eliza's behavior. She sent the doctor away rather than keeping him there to monitor a seriously injured patient. Why? If she wanted Stephen to survive, why dismiss medical care? The timing. Stephen's death made Eliza a wealthy widow with full control of his fortune. She'd been married to him for 22 years. She knew his wealth, and she knew that widowhood would give her independence she'd never had as a wife. No investigation. Despite suspicious circumstances, no formal investigation occurred. Stephen was buried. Eliza inherited everything. The matter was dropped. Did Eliza murder Stephen? We can't know with certainty, but the circumstances are suspicious enough that historians and murder mystery enthusiasts have debated it for nearly 2 centuries. The most likely scenario, Stephen's fall was accidental. The wounds were serious but survivable with proper care. Eliza recognized an opportunity. If Stephen died, she'd be free and wealthy.
She either actively removed the bandages or simply didn't secure them properly, allowing him to bleed out. Passive murder, not stabbing him herself, but creating conditions for death and letting nature take its course. It's impossible to prove, but it's consistent with Eliza's character: ambitious, calculating, willing to use people for her advancement. And what she did next suggests she felt no guilt. 14 months after Stephen's death, she married Aaron Burr.
Aaron Burr, in 1833, was 77 years old, disgraced and nearly broke. He'd been vice president under Thomas Jefferson from 1801 to 1805. But in 1804, he'd killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel in Weehawken, New Jersey. The killing destroyed his political career. He was charged with murder in both New York and New Jersey, though never tried. After leaving office in 1805, Burr became involved in schemes to create an independent nation in the Southwest, possibly including Spanish territories. He was tried for treason in 1807 and acquitted, but his reputation was ruined. He spent years in Europe trying to raise money and support for various schemes. He returned to New York in 1812 and practiced law, but never recovered his former prominence. By the 1830s, he was old, poor, living on the charity of friends and whatever legal work he could scrape together. Eliza-Jumel, meanwhile, was 58, though claiming to be younger, wealthy from Stephen's estate, and still desperately seeking social acceptance. Why would she marry Burr? Several reasons. Status. Burr was a former vice president. Disgraced, yes, but still historically significant. Marriage to him might give Eliza a connection to political history she'd never had. Validation. If a man of Burr's background would marry her, perhaps it proved she wasn't just a former prostitute. Perhaps it legitimized her. Companionship. She'd been a widow for 14 months. Perhaps she was lonely. Perhaps Burr, despite his age and disgrace, was charming company. Why would Burr marry Eliza? Simple. Money. He was broke, she was wealthy. Marriage gave him access to her fortune. They married on July 1, 1833, in the Morris-Jumel mansion's drawing room. Eliza was 58. Burr was 77. It was a disaster from the start.
The marriage lasted approximately 3 years, and it was characterized by fights over money. Eliza had married Burr thinking his name and reputation, however tarnished, would bring her social acceptance. Burr had married Eliza expecting access to her wealth. Both were disappointed. Eliza's social standing didn't improve. If anything, marriage to the man who'd killed Alexander Hamilton made her more scandalous, not less. New York society that had barely tolerated her before now had another reason to shun her. And Burr discovered that Eliza was not going to simply hand over her money. She'd spent 22 years married to Stephen, learning to manage finances and protect her interests. She wasn't about to let Burr squander her wealth. They fought, constantly. About money, about Eliza's past, about Burr's debts and schemes. By 1834, the marriage was functionally over. They lived separately, Burr in his law office, Eliza in the mansion. In 1834, Eliza discovered that Burr had been speculating with her money. He'd used her assets as collateral for loans. He'd invested in risky ventures without her permission. She was furious, and she decided to divorce him. Divorce in the 1830s was scandalous and difficult. It required proving fault, adultery, abandonment, or cruelty. It required legal representation and court proceedings, and it meant publicly airing the marriage's failures. Eliza didn't care. She wanted Burr gone and her money protected. And in a move of deliberate symbolic revenge, she hired Alexander Hamilton, Jr., son of the man Burr had killed 30 years earlier, as her divorce lawyer. The symbolism was unmistakable. The message to Burr: "You killed Hamilton, now his son will destroy your marriage." The divorce proceedings were ugly, public, humiliating for both parties. And on September 14, 1836, the divorce was finalized. That same day, September 14, 1836, Aaron Burr died. The timing is remarkable, not suspicious. Burr was 80 years old, in poor health, and had been declining for months. His death on the day the divorce finalized was coincidence, but it's the kind of coincidence that feels symbolic, as if Burr held on just long enough to see the marriage officially ended, then let go. Eliza was now twice a widow. Technically, Burr died the day they divorced, so arguably she was divorced, not widowed. She was 61 years old, wealthy, alone, and still not accepted by the society she'd spent decades trying to join. She would live another 29 years in the mansion, and those years would be characterized by increasing eccentricity, isolation, and decline.
From 1836 to 1865, Eliza lived alone in the Morris-Jumel mansion. She employed servants but had few visitors. Her attempts at social climbing had failed. Her two marriages, one possibly ending in murder, the other ending in scandal and divorce, had made her notorious rather than respectable. She became increasingly eccentric. Accounts from the 1840s to 1860s describe her walking the neighborhood in outdated purple silk dresses, yelling at children who came near the property, acting imperious and demanding while being largely ignored by society. Her mental state deteriorated. Whether dementia, mental illness, or simply the effects of isolation and bitterness, she became erratic. By the 1860s, she was rarely seen outside the mansion. She lived in a few rooms, the rest of the house falling into disrepair. The lavish furnishings she'd bought in 1810 were now decades old, faded, damaged. She died on July 16, 1865, at approximately 90 years old. She'd lied about her age so consistently that even death records are uncertain. She died alone, in the mansion she'd bought hoping it would bring her social acceptance, surrounded by the French furniture and European wallpaper that had failed to impress the elite. Her funeral was small, few attended. The woman who desperately wanted to be part of New York high society was buried with minimal ceremony. Her will divided her estate among various relatives and charitable causes. The mansion itself passed through her heirs and was eventually sold. By 1900, the house was deteriorating badly. It had passed through multiple owners, none of whom maintained it adequately. The neighborhood had changed, no longer rural and elite, but increasingly working class and immigrant. In 1903, a group of civic-minded New Yorkers formed the Washington Headquarters Association to purchase and preserve the mansion as a historic site. They raised funds, bought the property, and opened it as a museum in 1904. The focus was on George Washington's brief 1776 occupation. That was the historically respectable angle. The Eliza Jumel story, the scandalous marriages, the possible murder, the eccentric decline, was downplayed or omitted entirely. But ghosts don't follow curatorial decisions, and Eliza's ghost, according to numerous reports over the following decades, remained in the house. The hauntings at Morris-Jumel Mansion have been reported since at least the early 20th century. The most commonly reported ghost? Eliza herself. Multiple visitors, staff members, and paranormal investigators claim to have seen a woman in a purple dress on the second floor. The description is consistent. Middle-aged to elderly woman, wearing outdated 19th century clothing, particularly a purple silk dress. Some reports describe her as angry, yelling, gesturing aggressively. Others describe her as sad, standing by windows, looking out as if waiting for someone. A famous incident occurred in 1964. A school group was touring the mansion. One of the children reported seeing an old lady in purple who yelled at her to get out. The teacher saw nothing, but the child was genuinely frightened and refused to continue the tour. Other reported phenomena? Footsteps on the second floor when no one is there. Doors opening and closing without explanation. cold spots in certain rooms, the smell of lavender, supposedly Eliza's perfume, in areas where no source exists, objects moved or rearranged overnight when the museum is closed. Stephen Jumel has also been reported. During seances held at the mansion in the early mid-20th century, mediums claimed to contact Stephen's spirit. He allegedly accused Eliza of murdering him, removing his bandages and letting him bleed to death. Whether you believe these accounts depends on your openness to paranormal phenomena. Skeptics attribute them to suggestion, imagination, old building noises, and the power of knowing the building's dark history. But the reports are consistent enough and numerous enough that Morris-Jumel Mansion has a reputation as one of New York City's most haunted locations. Paranormal investigation teams have visited multiple times. They report EVP, or electronic voice phenomena, temperature anomalies, and electromagnetic field fluctuations consistent with alleged ghostly activity. The mansion's administration doesn't officially promote the ghost stories, but they don't discourage them either. Ghost tours and Halloween events are popular. The hauntings bring visitors who might not otherwise care about Revolutionary War history. And honestly, the ghost stories fit the house's character. A mansion built for social climbing, occupied during war, possibly the site of murder, definitely the site of scandal and eccentric decline. Of course it's haunted. Whether literally or metaphorically, Eliza Jumel's restless ambition still echoes through the rooms.
The mansion's current condition is concerning. In 2022, one of the front portico columns collapsed. It simply gave way, centuries-old wood finally succumbing to rot and weather damage. A preservation engineer inspected the structure and described touching other columns. Touch it, and you walk away with moist, splintered clump of wood. The mansion is deteriorating badly. It needs millions in restoration and preservation work. The roof leaks, the foundation has issues, the historic wallpaper is fading and peeling, the floorboards are warped. The museum operates on a limited budget. Admission fees, donations, small grants. It's enough for basic operations and minimal maintenance, but not major restoration. And Morris-Jumel Mansion competes for attention and funding with dozens of other historic sites in New York City. It's historically significant, oldest house in Manhattan, Washington's headquarters, but not the most famous or visited. The mansion sees approximately 30,000 visitors annually. That's respectable for a small historic house museum, but far less than major attractions. Without significant investment soon, the mansion will continue deteriorating. It won't collapse immediately, the structure is still fundamentally sound, but slow decay is inevitable without proper maintenance. This creates a tragic irony. Eliza Jumel bought the mansion hoping to secure her place in society. She spent lavishly on furnishings and renovations. She hosted parties desperately trying to impress the elite. And now, 160 years after her death, the mansion she bought for social climbing is crumbling from neglect. The society she tried to join doesn't care enough to fully fund its preservation. The house that was supposed to elevate her is falling apart, just like her ambitions fell apart, just like her marriages fell apart, just like her mental state fell apart in her final years. The mansion and Eliza's life story mirror each other. Beautiful facades hiding structural decay, grand aspirations undermined by flawed foundations, desperate attempts at respectability ending in isolation and decline. Let's return to the numbers because they reveal the scale of Eliza's ambitions and failures. The mansion itself, built 1765, square footage approximately 11,000 square feet across 2 floors plus attic and basement. Rooms, 15 principal rooms. Architectural style, Georgian, Palladian. Notable features, octagonal drawing room, 2-story portico, high ceilings, 11 to 12 feet on first floor. Purchase and renovation, 1810. Purchase price, $10,000, approximately $200,000 in 2024 dollars, modest for such a property, reflecting its deteriorated state.
Renovation costs, unknown precisely, but contemporary accounts suggest Eliza spent lavishly, possibly $20,000 to $30,000 on furniture, wallpaper, and improvements, approximately $400,000 to $600,000 today. Stephen Jumel's wealth at death, 1832, estate value approximately $500,000 to $1 million, roughly $15 to $30 million in 2024 dollars. Eliza inherited everything, making her one of the wealthiest women in New York. Aaron Burr marriage, 1833 to 1836. Burr's debts at marriage, tens of thousands of dollars. Eliza's losses from Burr's speculation, unknown but significant enough to prompt divorce. Legal costs for divorce, substantial for the era. Eliza's wealth at death, 1865. Estate value, approximately $250,000, roughly $4.5 million in 2024 dollars. Significant decrease from her 1832 inheritance, likely due to Burr's speculation, failed investments, and decades of mansion upkeep. Current mansion value, as museum or historic site, priceless culturally, minimal financially. If sold as private residence, likely $5 to $10 million given location, historic significance, and poor condition. Annual operating budget estimated $300,000 to $500,000. Needed restoration funds $5 to $10 million. Visitor numbers, annual visitors approximately 30,000. Admission fee approximately $10 adults, $5 students or seniors. Annual admission revenue roughly $200,000 to $250,000, significant but insufficient for major preservation. These numbers show the gap between Eliza's ambitions and reality. She spent hundreds of thousands, in modern terms, trying to buy social acceptance. She inherited millions from Stephen, and she died with a fraction of that wealth, still not accepted, still isolated. The mansion she bought to elevate her became the place she died alone. And now it's a deteriorating museum that can't quite afford to preserve itself. The economics of ambition in numbers.
The George Washington connection deserves closer examination because it's both historically significant and romantically ironic. Washington used Morris-Jumel Mansion as his headquarters from September 14 to October 20, 1776, just over 5 weeks. During that time, he planned defensive strategy against the approaching British invasion. He met with generals including Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox. He wrote dispatches to Congress. And he lost. The Battle of Harlem Heights, fought September 16th just south of the mansion, was technically an American tactical victory, but strategically meaningless. The British continued advancing. Washington was forced to retreat north, abandoning Manhattan entirely. The mansion became Washington's headquarters not because it was militarily ideal, but because it was available and had good views. The high ground allowed observation of British movements. The building was large enough to house Washington and his staff. But the romantic detail that tour guides love, this was the house built by Roger Morris, who'd married Mary Phillips, the woman Washington had courted and lost. Did Washington think about that during his 5 weeks there? Did he stand in rooms built by his romantic rival? Did it matter? Probably not much. Washington was 44 in 1776, married to Martha for 17 years. The Mary Phillips courtship was 20 years in the past. He had a war to fight and was losing. But the story persists because it's compelling. The unrequited love angle adds human drama to military history. And there's no evidence Washington ever returned to the mansion after 1776. When he visited New York as president in the 1790s, he stayed elsewhere. The mansion held no particular significance for him beyond those 5 weeks of military occupation. The Washington connection is historically real. He did use the mansion. His presence is documented. But it's been romanticized far beyond its actual importance to Washington's life or the Revolutionary War. The mansion matters more for what happened after Washington left: the British occupation, the Jumel era, the scandals and possible murder, the ghost stories. Washington's ghost isn't reported at Morris-Jumel Mansion.
Eliza's is. Because Washington spent 5 weeks there during a war, Eliza spent 55 years there obsessing over social status and dying alone. Whose presence would linger more strongly?
The neighborhood around Morris-Jumel Mansion has changed dramatically since 1765. When Roger Morris built it, the area was rural, farmland, woods. The nearest developed area was 8 miles south in Lower Manhattan. This was countryside, a summer retreat from the city. By Eliza Jumel's era, 1810 to 1865, the area was still relatively rural but developing. Roads had improved, more people lived in Upper Manhattan, but it was still far from the city center. By 1900, when the mansion became a museum, the neighborhood had transformed. Washington Heights was urbanizing rapidly. Immigrants, Irish, German, Jewish, later African American, and Latino moved into the area. Tenements replaced farms. The mansion became an architectural anomaly, a Georgian manor house surrounded by urban density. The views Roger Morris had enjoyed of the Hudson were now partially blocked by buildings. Throughout the 20th century, Washington Heights went through cycles of prosperity and decline. The area around the mansion varied from working-class stability to poverty and crime. Today, Washington Heights is gentrifying. Property values are rising. The area is becoming more affluent, though still diverse and working/middle class. But the mansion remains somewhat isolated. It sits on a small plot, far smaller than the original estate. The grounds are minimal. You can't recreate the rural retreat experience Morris intended. The house that was built to escape the city is now surrounded by it. The views are partially blocked. The rural tranquility is replaced by urban noise. This geographical change mirrors Eliza's story. She bought the mansion hoping to recreate elite country estate life, but she couldn't escape her urban working-class origins any more than the mansion can escape being in the middle of modern Manhattan. The context changed, the house remained, and the gap between what it was meant to be and what it became defines both the building and Eliza's failed ambitions.
The Morris family's loyalist choice destroyed them financially and historically. Roger Morris fled to England in 1776. His American properties, the mansion, land holdings, other assets, were confiscated as Loyalist property. The new American government seized everything and sold it off. Morris lived in England on a British military pension, comfortable but far less wealthy than he'd been. He died in 1794, having never returned to America. Mary Phillips Morris outlived him by 31 years, dying in 1825 in England. She also never returned. Their descendants remained in Britain. The American branch of the family ceased to exist. Their name is remembered primarily through the mansion, and even then, most people know it as Eliza Jumel Mansion, or just Jumel Mansion, emphasizing Eliza's era over Roger's. This raises a question: what does loyalty cost? Morris was loyal to Britain. That loyalty was sincere. He was British, had served in British military, benefited from British colonial system. His choice was understandable given his background. But it cost him everything in America: his property, his home, his social position. He became an exile, living on charity in a foreign country, even though technically Britain was his home country. Meanwhile, the mansion he'd built, intended as his summer retreat, became a Revolutionary War site, then a scandalous widow's residence, then a museum celebrating American independence. The house built by a loyalist became a shrine to the revolution he opposed. That's historical irony. Morris's choice was principled, and it destroyed his American legacy. While Washington, who'd briefly courted Morris's wife and lost, became the father of his country and a legend. Sometimes loyalty costs everything, and sometimes the winners write history so thoroughly that the losers are remembered only as footnotes to buildings they built. Eliza's desperate social climbing reveals class dynamics in early 19th century New York. She came from poverty and sex work. Stephen Jumel came from merchant class. They had money, but not breeding. New York's elite, the old Dutch families, Van Rensselaers, Schuylers, the British colonial families that stayed after the Revolution, controlled social access.
They decided who was acceptable and who wasn't. Eliza and Stephen had wealth, but wealth alone didn't guarantee acceptance. You needed family background, education, manners, connections. Eliza tried to buy her way in. She bought the right house, former residence of British elite, used by Washington. She bought the right furnishings, French, expensive. She hosted the right kind of parties, elaborate, generous. And it failed, because the elite could take her money, attend her parties, accept her hospitality, without accepting her personally. They came, they ate her food, they admired her house, and they gossiped about her scandalous past and never invited her to their events. This dynamic drove Eliza to increasingly desperate measures. The marriage to Aaron Burr, a man 40 years past his prime, disgraced, but still a former vice president, was an attempt to acquire status through association. It failed, too, and made her more scandalous. By her later years, Eliza had given up. She stopped trying to impress society. She lived alone, eccentric, bitter. The purple dresses she wore were decades out of fashion. She'd stopped caring about current style because current society had rejected her completely. Her story is both sympathetic and cautionary. Sympathetic because she came from nothing and tried desperately to better herself. Cautionary because she pursued status so obsessively that she destroyed her own happiness. She could have lived comfortably with Stephen's wealth, traveled, enjoyed life, built genuine friendships rather than trying to force elite acceptance. Instead, she spent 55 years in a mansion trying to impress people who would never accept her, and she died alone, having gained nothing but a reputation as a possibly murderous, definitely scandalous eccentric. The pursuit of status destroyed her more thoroughly than poverty ever had.
The murder question, did Eliza kill Stephen, can't be definitively answered, but we can examine the evidence. In favor of murder, suspicious circumstances, Stephen died from bleeding after Eliza sent the doctor away and took over his care. Motive, his death made her a wealthy, independent widow. Timing, she remarried just 14 months later, suggesting she wasn't devastated by his death. Character, Eliza was ambitious, calculating, and willing to use people for advancement. Seance reports. Mediums in later years claimed Stephen's ghost accused her of murder. Against murder. No investigation. If authorities suspected murder, they would have investigated. They didn't. No witnesses. No one reportedly saw Eliza harm Stephen or deliberately remove bandages. Alternative explanation. Stephen was in his 50s or 60s, accounts vary, possibly elderly and frail. The pitchfork wounds could have been more serious than initially assessed. He could have died despite proper care. Legal marriage. Eliza had no need to murder Stephen. She benefited from his wealth while he lived and could have simply waited for natural death. Most likely scenario. Stephen's fall was accidental. The wounds were serious. A doctor treated him and left instructions for care. Eliza, seeing an opportunity, either deliberately removed the bandages or simply didn't apply them as carefully as instructed. She let him bleed out, not actively killing him, but creating conditions for death and not preventing it. This is passive murder, not as clearly criminal as stabbing someone, but morally culpable. She had the knowledge and ability to save him and chose not to. It's impossible to prove 190 years later, but it fits Eliza's character and the circumstances. And it explains why there was no investigation. Passive murder through negligence is much harder to detect and prosecute than active violence. Whether Eliza killed Stephen or simply let him die, the result was the same. She became a wealthy widow and quickly moved on to her next marriage. And Stephen, if the seance reports are to be believed, remained angry about it even in death. The Aaron Burr marriage deserves analysis because it reveals both parties' desperation. Burr, in 1833, was broke, disgraced, and dying. He'd lost everything: political career, reputation, wealth. He was living on charity and whatever legal work he could find. Marriage to Eliza offered financial survival. She was wealthy. Marriage gave him legal access to her money.
Women's property rights were limited in the 1830s. Husbands controlled wives' assets in most cases. But Eliza wasn't stupid. She'd spent 22 years married to Stephen, learning to protect her financial interests. She wasn't going to simply hand everything over to Burr. So Burr tried to manipulate her finances anyway. He used her money as collateral. He speculated. He made investments without her consent. And Eliza caught him, and she was furious. The divorce was her way of fighting back. She hired Alexander Hamilton Jr., the ultimate symbolic revenge. Hamilton had killed Hamilton Sr. in 1804. Now Hamilton's son would destroy Burr's marriage in 1836. The symbolism was intentional and cruel. Eliza wanted Burr humiliated. She wanted revenge for his financial manipulation, and she wanted everyone to know she wouldn't tolerate being used. The divorce proceedings were public and ugly. Burr's financial misdeeds were aired. Eliza's past was dredged up. Both parties were humiliated. But Eliza won. The divorce was granted. Her assets were protected. Burr got nothing. And then he died, the same day the divorce finalized. That timing, whether coincidence or Burr holding on just long enough to see it end, adds dark poetry to the story. Two desperate people, two failed attempts to use each other for survival and status, and both left worse off than before. Burr died broke and alone. Eliza lived another 29 years, but equally alone, having burned her last bridge to potential respectability. The marriage that was supposed to save them both destroyed what little they had left.
The 1964 schoolgirl incident, seeing Eliza's ghost yelling "Get out," has become the mansion's most famous paranormal story. According to the report, a school group was touring the second floor. One girl, approximately 10 years old, became visibly frightened and refused to continue. When asked what was wrong, she described seeing an old lady in purple who yelled at me to get out. The teachers saw nothing. Other students saw nothing. But the girl was genuinely terrified, not performing, not seeking attention. She believed she'd seen something. The tour guide at the time confirmed the incident, and similar reports have occurred before and since, always on the second floor, always a woman in purple, often angry or aggressive. Skeptics offer explanations. Suggestion: the girl knew the building was supposedly haunted and her imagination created the experience. Peripheral vision tricks. Old buildings have shadows, reflections, visual artifacts that can be misinterpreted. Sleep deprivation or stress. School field trips can be overstimulating. The girl might have been tired and hallucinated. Fabrication. Children sometimes lie or exaggerate for attention. Believers counter. The consistency. Multiple people across decades report the same figure. Purple dress, elderly woman, second floor. The emotional reaction. True fear is hard to fake, especially in children. The specificity. The girl described details, purple dress, angry expression, consistent with historical descriptions of Eliza. What's interesting is how the story has become part of the mansion's identity. Tour guides tell it, paranormal investigators reference it, media coverage includes it. Whether literally true or not, the story serves a function. It keeps Eliza's presence alive. It reminds visitors that this isn't just a historical building. It's a place where someone lived, suffered, and died, where emotions were so intense they allegedly left traces. And whether those traces are paranormal or purely psychological doesn't really matter for the story's power. Eliza wanted to be remembered. She wanted her mansion to mean something. She wanted social significance. She got it, just not the way she intended. She's remembered as a ghost, as a scandal, as a possibly murderous, definitely tragic figure who haunts the building she bought hoping for respectability. That's a kind of immortality. Not the kind she wanted, but immortality nonetheless. The mansion's financial struggles reflect a broader problem in historic preservation. Historic house museums are expensive to maintain. They require climate control to preserve artifacts and structure, security systems and staff, insurance, high premiums for old buildings, ongoing maintenance, roofs, foundations, systems, curatorial staff and programming, marketing and outreach. Revenue sources are limited. Admission fees, typically modest, $5 to $15, gift shop sales, small margins, event rentals, weddings, parties, but limited by building constraints, donations, unpredictable, grants, competitive, requiring extensive applications. For a site like the Morris-Jumel mansion, historically significant but not a top-tier tourist attraction, the economics are challenging. 30,000 annual visitors at $10 average admission equals $300,000 revenue. Gift shop, events, donations might add another $100,000 to $200,000. Total annual revenue approximately $400,000 to $500,000, but annual costs easily reach that or exceed it, which leaves nothing for major restoration projects. The 2022 column collapse highlights the crisis. The mansion needs millions in structural work, but generating that money through normal operations is impossible. Options: major capital campaign, requires wealthy donors interested in the site. Government grants, competitive, require matching funds. Selling assets, but a historic house museum has few liquid assets. Increased tourism, but how? The site is already well known locally. Without intervention, Morris-Jumel mansion will continue deteriorating. Not quickly, it won't collapse tomorrow, but steadily. Another decade or two of deferred maintenance will create crisis-level damage. This is the fate of many historic house museums. They survive on minimal budgets, slowly declining, hoping for major donors or government intervention that may never come. Eliza bought the mansion hoping it would elevate her. Now the mansion needs elevation, its budget, its visitor numbers, its donor support. The irony continues. The house built for social climbing now desperately needs society to care enough to save it. Standing in Morris-Jumel mansion today, certain rooms feel more charged than others. The octagonal drawing room, where Washington planned strategy, where Eliza married Aaron Burr, feels historically heavy. You can imagine the conversations, the decisions, the desperate hopes. The bedroom where Stephen died, where Eliza possibly committed passive murder, feels darker. Even skeptics report discomfort there, whether paranormal sensitivity or psychological response to knowing what happened. The room carries weight. The second-floor hallway, where Eliza's ghost is most often reported, feels watched. Tour guides mention that feeling of being observed even when alone in the building. The dining room, where elaborate parties tried to impress society that never accepted Eliza, feels sad. All that effort, all that expense, all for nothing. But perhaps the most poignant space is the front portico. Standing there, you see what Roger Morris saw in 1765, the view south toward Manhattan, now blocked by buildings, but you can imagine it. You see what Washington saw in 1776 when he watched for British ships. And you imagine Eliza standing there in her later years, looking at the city that rejected her, walking back inside to empty rooms and fading grandeur. The portico represents aspiration, the view represents possibility, and inside the house represents reality. Beautiful but decaying, ambitious but failed, grand but lonely. That gap between the aspiration visible from the portico and the reality inside defines the mansion's entire history. Roger Morris aspired to summer leisure with his wife. War destroyed that. Washington aspired to defend New York. He failed and retreated. Eliza aspired to social acceptance. She failed and died alone. The mansion aspired to be a permanent monument. It's slowly collapsing. Aspiration meets reality at Morris-Jumel mansion, and reality wins every time. Morris-Jumel mansion stands today at 65 Jumel Terrace in Washington Heights, Manhattan. The oldest house in Manhattan, built 1765. Revolutionary War headquarters, possible murder site, definitely a scandal site, reportedly haunted. Approximately 30,000 visitors tour it annually.
They see restored rooms with period furnishings. They learn about Washington's brief occupation. They hear about Eliza's scandalous marriages. And many report feeling something, a presence, a heaviness, a sense that they're not alone. Whether that's paranormal or psychological doesn't matter for the experience. The mansion carries its history visibly. The scandals, the ambitions, the failures, all embedded in the architecture. Roger Morris built it for summer leisure and lost it to revolution. George Washington used it briefly and lost the battle for New York. Eliza Jumel bought it hoping for social acceptance and died alone, ostracized. Aaron Burr married into it seeking financial salvation and died broke the day his divorce finalized. The mansion has witnessed unrequited love, Washington and Mary Phillips, war, occupation, possible murder, scandalous marriages, eccentric decline, and alleged hauntings. It represents American history's messy reality, not the sanitized version taught in schools, but the complicated, scandalous, human version. The house that was supposed to elevate everyone who owned it instead revealed their flaws. Morris's loyalism, Washington's military setbacks, Eliza's impossible social ambitions, Burr's financial desperation. Buildings don't make people better. They just provide stages for human drama. And Morris-Jumel Mansion has been one of history's best stages. The drama played out there over 260 years, from construction in 1765 to today, contains everything: romance, war, murder, scandal, ghosts. The mansion is deteriorating. Columns collapse, wood rots. Without significant investment, it will continue declining. But even in decline, it tells its story, perhaps more honestly than when it was grand. Because the rot and decay mirror Eliza's later years, the faded purple dresses, the deteriorating mental state, the crumbling social aspirations. The mansion and its most famous resident share the same fate, built for greatness, ending in slow collapse, leaving behind only stories and alleged ghosts. Eliza wanted respectability, she got notoriety. She wanted social acceptance, she got isolation. She wanted her mansion to be remembered. It is, as New York's most haunted house. Not what she intended, but maybe what she deserved. Or maybe just what happens when ambition crashes against reality and reality wins. The mansion stands, decaying but standing. Eliza's ghost allegedly walks the second floor, angry, restless, still fighting for the acceptance that eluded her in life. The purple dress is tattered now. The yelling falls on deaf ears. The social climbing ended in death and dust. But the performance continues, because that's what haunting is: performance that never ends, repetition of patterns that never resolved. Eliza bought a mansion to elevate herself. She died alone in it, having gained nothing. And now she's trapped there, allegedly, repeating her failures for eternity. The oldest house in Manhattan, the most haunted, the most tragic. Built for summer leisure in 1765, now a monument to everything that can go wrong when you build your dreams on scandal, murder, and desperate social climbing. The mansion remains, beautiful in its decay, honest in its deterioration, a house that aspired to greatness and settled for infamy, just like everyone who ever lived there.